Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Felipe Campante, a professor here at SAIS, and also, as of a couple of weeks ago, also Vice Dean for Academic Affairs. And I have, Kent graciously declined the opportunity to introduce himself as a speaker in today's lunch. So I have the double pleasure of doing that. First, to be kind of, being a part of this wonderful initiative that, Kent has sponsored, which I think is a great way of sort of bringing us together and sort of showcasing and fostering sort of the intellectual community here at SAIS. So I'm happy that, so last year I couldn't come on a regular basis because it was kind of my designated Baltimore day, but this year I'm hoping that I can come here on a regular basis. And the second pleasure is just to introduce Kent himself, who I already sort of, all of us know him also as our Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs, and I very much appreciated his contribution to this school on that front. But now I appreciate it more and more as I kind of get acquainted with my new position, and I sort of benefit from Kent's dedication and perspective and overall wisdom. And besides being a very effective and dedicated Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs, Kent is actually a leading thinker and scholar, policy thinker and scholar in Japan and East Asia more broadly, and a thinker of a great depth and breadth as well. So the number of topics that he's dealt with is quite amazing. So it's really a pleasure to be here and doing that, and in particular because sort of the direction I think that Kent is taking his research at this point is very much one that I think is really important, and I'm a big believer in terms of the importance of geography and the importance of space still in this day and age where some might think that, distance has died, and maybe geography doesn't matter as much as it did before. But I think it's great that Kent is pushing this agenda and sort of looking at this with the appropriate degree of ambition and rigor that he is very much well known for. So it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Kent Calder. So, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Felipe. We really are lucky to have a Vice Dean for Academic Affairs like Felipe, who also has very, very broad intellectual interests. As you know, he's a Bloomberg professor. He spends time at our Homewood campus as well, and epitomizes the one Hopkins concept, which I think in the future of this university is going to become more and more important. We're very, very lucky to have him as Vice Dean for Academic Affairs. Today, I should also stress a point that he began to mention. This is I guess, the 7th iteration now of the SAIS Faculty Research Forum, and in creating this last year, our intention was to really build on the sense of community within SAIS and to deepen that. And I'm gratified that several previous members, previous presenters from last year, Francisco Gonzalez, Lisa Hintz, Dan Server, among them, are here today, and others that have first-rate, exciting books to present, Nargis Bajoli and Dan Markey, whose book on China's Western Horizon I've been reading with great interest, coming out from Oxford University Press soon. And that is something that we will also like to feature. Next month, actually, Nargis will be presenting her new book relating to Iran. So we want to, and I'm also gratified that there are so many. Just looking around the audience, I see at least 10 of my colleagues or more, and also many of our PhD students and our students here at SAIS, as well as, of course, our visiting scholars, right from and faculties, Mark Gilbert from Bologna. So it's really an opportunity to developed this sense of community that personally I think is increasingly important in the period of transformation that we're in here at SAIS. Now, to make my small contribution, and I promise you this is the one and only time that actually I'm, as Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs, that I'm going to be appearing in any of these series. I'd like to talk about my new book, Supercontinent, The Logic of Eurasian Integration, that just came out from Stanford University Press. And I'm honored that we have the director of China Studies, Andy Murtha, one of our closest colleagues and finest colleagues, here to do some commentary. I thought a lot about how I should present this. I'm not a particular fan of PowerPoint presentations because often they take us away from a qualitative understanding of the work that we're trying to do. But I do think, particularly because, as Felipe was saying, geography and space, I agree very much with him, and that's an area that I hope we can also have here at SAIS a deeper dialogue about, because geography and maps and so on are a major part of this work. I thought that it was important to show that. Bringing geography back in is one of our major objectives here. We just did actually the first, what I think is the first workshop on political geography that the American Political Science Association has hosted just about 2 weeks ago here in Washington. And I agree very much with Felipe that this is something, thinking about what geography and space mean, particularly in an era of technological change, of the internet and rapid telecommunications, and then arguments that the world is flat and so on. In that kind of a world, what difference does geography make? Conceptualizing that, understanding nuances and distinctions, considering that question of really whether geography is becoming less significant today, I think is a topic worth exploring, and that's right at the heart of this particular book. There are, to turn to that question, there's at least two clear ways, it seems to me, in which geography, no matter how you cut the implications of the internet and so on, does continue to matter. Natural resources. Natural resources don't move. Transportation and communication. It does take time to get from place to place. And that may well be changing, and that may force us to reconceptualize, but the time of transportation and communication has not depreciated to zero. Not only do I think geography does matter, and I'll come back to that, but I think continents matter more than we've traditionally thought. Conceptually, in the notion of manifest destiny, in the overambitious attempts of the United States at various times in history to forcefully integrate with both Canada and Mexico, the notion of continentalism has reared its head occasionally in American history, and of course in the 19th century particularly. Also at the time of NAFTA, in both Canada and the United States, there was some consideration of this concept in that context. The notion of Europe, what is Europe exactly? Does this include Turkey or not? Just as one rather specific issue, has been a subject which has been broadly debated. We talk about Pan-Africanism. I can recall as a boy having been at the inauguration of Africa Hall in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And of course, in those days, with Nasser and Ben Bella and Nkrumah, many of the African leaders, and Haile Selassie there, that whole question of what Africa is, what the continent in fact is, was a very, very live issue. And an important one for the participants and also for the world. So we haven't, it's been sporadic, the analysis of continents, but particularly having been, I'm originally, some of you know, I'm from Utah, not far from Promontory Point, where the Golden Spike was laid and where the transcontinental railroad integration occurred. In fact, Toshko and I were out there just to watch one of those commemorations a couple of months ago, the 150th anniversary. So that kept me thinking about this issue of continentalism. And in North America, we've talked about it. Does this relate at all to Eurasia? Dan talks about China's western horizon. It's not the same sort of sea-to-sea conception or that exists in North America. But land connects oceans, and continental scale, I should say, finally, does matter, potentially. Not necessarily, but potentially. Eurasia has 40% of the world's land area, 70% of world output in purchasing power parity, 60% of world oil reserves, and 80% of conventional world gas reserves. And even if, of course, shale gas is becoming important, but still the share of Eurasia remains extremely great. Geographically speaking, of course, the distances across the continent are significantly shorter than those around the continent, about 30% shorter. It is true that sea transport is cheaper. Relative costs, however, are significantly changing. The emergence of e-commerce makes production networks much easier. The political barriers to land transport are declining. Infrastructure through Belt and Road and other mechanisms is improving. And then there's intermodal transport as well, which the Chinese have picked up with their port at Piraeus, a new port that's going in at Trieste, and so on. And so the changes in transportation and communication are reconfiguring, and politics as well, are reconfiguring an equation that once was thought as prohibitive of deep economic relations across the continent. I can give a lot of discussion later. The auto relationship between China, central China, and Germany, for example. The fact that half of the world's PCs are produced in Chongqing, and a good portion of those go right across the continent by rail now, and some by air to Germany and other parts of Europe. So there's potential in the configuration that we have here of Eurasia, is the point that I would make first, which leads really to this statement that caused me to begin my work on this book. Cumulative Eurasia's power vastly overshadows America. Fortunately for America, Eurasia is too big to be politically one, which comes from Zbig Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, 1996, as I think a lot of you know. Brzezinski understood, I think, the potential of Eurasia, although in his day he rather confidently asserted that this did not necessarily have broader implications. The argument that I will make, as you'll see in the coming page or coming minutes, is that it actually does have, more recent developments do have significant implications. They haven't created a United States of Eurasia or created a clear entente across the continent, but there are, in various ways, deepening relationships that are beginning to have broader significance, particularly in the world of Donald Trump, of confrontation with China and a deep U.S.-China economic competition, and also deepening infrastructural ties and deepening relations of various kinds across the Eurasian continent. Not with all countries, but with many significant ones, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe and countries that span the two, such as Turkey and Russia. Critical junctures have been a key element of this transformation of Eurasia. China's modernizations unleashed economic growth, and that meant a need for resources, China's attractiveness as a market, an ability to finance infrastructure and other developments across the continent. Many years later, of course, much of this became manifest in Belt and Road. But the preconditions for this far predate President Xi's announcement. I wrote about the new continentalism in 2012, and I think certainly developments have moved along those lines, but the basis is much earlier. The collapse of the Soviet Union, it opened a space for connectivity across the continent. The Lehman shock, it amplified the importance of China's market with a huge stimulus package. It stimulated infrastructure spending, the beginnings within China, first of all. And as we'll see, the distance within China itself, domestically within China, is halfway to the border of the Schengen across the continent. Then finally, I think another key development was the Ukraine crisis, which isolated Russia from Europe, forced Russia into greater dependence on the East, and then also increased the interest of the 16+1 nations in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, what has this begun to produce? The evidence that I would like to present, is, I just want, much of this is anecdotal, but I think you'll see the basic points. First, of course, trade between China and the EU member states has gone up about 30-fold between 1990 and 2017, and it's continued to grow even from there. There are about 4 or 5 transcontinental rail cargo trips per year, or per day, actually, 4 to 5 per day, that are going between places such as Łódź in Poland or Duisburg in Germany and China, particularly central China. A number of bilateral and multilateral mechanisms, of course, have begun to develop. I think one shouldn't make too much about these, but one shouldn't depreciate them either. The 16+1, and now 17+1, because Greece has joined as well, between Eastern Europe and China, I think, is the most significant. SCO might well be the one that's the most prominent. The other thing that I would add to this is the catalytic role of middle-range powers in the emergence of a broader interdependence across the continent. The most recent case, I think, is Uzbekistan, which has opened and developed stronger ties both with China and also nations to the west, as well as within Central Asia. Also, of course, Turkey, I would say, in the last 2 or 3 years under Erdogan particularly. Professor Hintz is really specialized on this. But there's been important changes even in countries like Mongolia, which was very adverse until the very last 2 or 3 years to infrastructure across Mongolia. But it has begun to play, I should argue, a somewhat different role in the continent recently, just as Uzbekistan and Turkey have. And Professor Alicia Kempe here, of course, president of the Mongolia Society and also a real specialist on this issue. Another aspect of this integration is the changes that have happened within individual countries or regions. Within Europe itself, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, led to an important set of changes inside Europe that I stress quite a bit. That ultimately led to the birth of this 16+1, to much deeper ties with a country, China, where the traditional ties were quite strong even from the days of the Warsaw Pact, trying to balance across the continent against Soviet power by a relationship with China. And so Europe has changed in ways that make a relationship across the continent easier, including geographically. The economic center of Europe has moved significantly to the east from where it was in Cold War days. Conversely, and again, I defer to Professor Murtha and others, I wouldn't overstate this, but since the days of Jiang Zemin's Western policies, China's, some internal parts of China, particularly Sichuan and some of the areas in central China that Professor Murtha has worked on, have become more significant economically than they were. And the pattern of the early outward-looking days of the SEZs along the coast has yielded to a broader pattern of development in a center of gravity that's moving further to the west. So as you can see, I think to understand the dynamic across the continent, one can't look at just one country, and one can't ignore technological change or political change. It's a matter of a much broader pattern of transformation that transcends the analysis of just one country. That isn't to say that geography doesn't matter. And I've given several examples of where I think this integration is beginning to occur. Then the question is, why does it occur? I think here's where we need to start with geography. Look at where China is. Of course, the former Soviet Union, Russia, is much larger and extends across the continent, but this is the Arctic and largely unpopulated. If you take the populated portion of Asia, China is right in the middle of it. It's literally the Middle Kingdom. And that has had, particularly as China begins to expand and become stronger economically, that has had more and more important geo-economic implications. When China is weak, its centrality is its misfortune. It means that other countries, just as in the 19th century, can take advantage of China, imperialism can advance. However, if China is strong, the converse, its geographical location, becomes a considerable geo-economic strength. Its market is more accessible. Its strategic position is stronger. The pressure, asymmetric pressure that it can put on neighbors becomes greater. So the centrality of China is a very important factor in the transformation of Eurasia. That we've always talked about China as Middle Kingdom, but we don't really look at the implications enough, it seems to me, which is why at least I think there's a room for analysis that includes China, but within a broader sort of framework. Energy is another aspect of that interdependence. Helps us to answer the question of why the world is evolving the way it is. China, with its centrality, has many options for energy supply. It can get supply from Russia, it can get supply from Central Asia, it can get supply directly from the Gulf by sea. And this gives China, if it has an expanding market, a leverage, a geo-economic leverage that compared to the producers, especially in a buyer's market, gives them considerable leverage in relationship to big countries like Russia. Logistics. there's an important logistics revolution which is going on that I think has not been remarked enough, but that also helps to leverage the position of China, but not just China. Other countries that have some complex combination of sea and land communication. Turkey is another. Azerbaijan is one. Iran potentially could be one. The Trans-Caspian, the emergence of the Trans-Caspian, I think, is changing the geo-economics of Asia significantly. But many of these do benefit China because of its large markets. I talk a lot more in the book. Some of that's a bit technical, so I don't want to go into great detail here. But the Internet of Things, the ability to go cheaply because of digitalization from road to rail to sea and back again, is creating great advantages for a power that does a lot of trade. This is exactly why President Xi made a deal to build a Chinese port at Trieste, at the top of the Adriatic, or why the Chinese bought the port of Piraeus in Greece to deepen these relationships with Europe that I'm going to talk about. Finance, again, not to be labored. Many of you know this, the new institutions, the AIIB, the Silk Road Fund, the massive scale of Chinese sovereign wealth funds and the way that they're being used also leverage this deepening integration, and Belt and Road has been a key element of that. Now, at the micro level, and I just want to note this, I think micro is also somewhat important. State-owned enterprises have been important in this integration. Costco is the third largest shipping company in the world. United States doesn't have any among the largest shipping countries. The China Railway Corporation carries more passengers than any other company on earth. The CRC is the largest rolling manufacturing company in the world. Huawei is in sales, I guess, the second in routers. They're large. They're one of the most important telecom companies in the world. Alibaba, together with Amazon, is the largest e-commerce company in the world. So there's a micro dimension, and I'll come back to that. I think there's moral hazard. Some of this is inefficient. There's debt bombs, you know, a lot of the things that are objections that we see. But the simple scale of the intermediaries, the firms that are handling this transcontinental integration actually are something we need to take account of. Changes between Russia and China. This one really is I think the most important. In relative scale, as you can see here, the Russian economy in 1991 was larger than the Chinese economy. Today, the Chinese economy is 6 times as large as the Russian economy. In nominal terms, Russia's economy is the size of South Korea. And so there's been a very sharp transformation in the relative relationship of China and Russia, some of which we're seeing in the technology sphere, where Russia has supplied increasing amounts of technology, including defense technology, to China. That do have broader globalization implications, and I go into those in the book. The changes in Europe are another important aspect of the unbalanced pattern of Eurasia, which has been emerging. The heart of the matter is here in Eastern Europe. These are all new members of the European Union and most of the members of NATO just since the collapse of the Soviet Union. These here in the Western Balkans, of course, are not members of the EU yet. So there's a slightly different position, but that makes it even easier for China. These countries are within the European Union, and so they have a major say in policy. They are able to veto new measures on the part of the European Union. And they have deep trading relationships with China as well. Now, what does this lead to? And let me just move quickly toward the conclusion. The intellectual base for this is the work of Theodore Lowy, which some of you know, his classic typology on varieties of policymaking. And basically what I'm saying is that our classical system for global governance has been regulatory through a set of rules, essentially, and with some degree of coherent unitary leadership. What I think we are moving toward, and BRI is certainly a big element of this, is a very different sort of system. It isn't necessarily contradictory. I think the Chinese can say with some degree of it's self-serving, but some degree of candor that they are willing to conform to existing rules of the system, and in certain ways, given protectionism or mercantilism in the United States as well, there are some parts of the high ground I think that they hold. It's obviously not. The United States has been the heart of the free trade system for a long time, and I don't mean to be apologetic. But what I do think is happening is underneath the radar, essentially what this means is that through distributive policies, which don't need to be zero-sum, I think the important thing is that without a black and white rule-based sort of system, you can simply allocate resources, and you can allocate them in larger or smaller quantities and break down in a very fine way the compensation that you provide. It's not contradictory to a rule-based system, but it operates outside of a rule-based system. And effectively speaking, what it leads to is a transformation of global governance over time. Or let me say this, at least it's potentially subversive of classical systems of global governance. Now, I think as grand strategy, no doubt, given the changes across the continent, the increasing openness since the collapse of the Soviet Union of the continent, the size of the Chinese market, the resources China has to deploy, as a grand strategy for China, the Belt and Road is, I think, an attractive strategy. It's an astute grand strategy as far as it goes. But let me just conclude essentially by my 2 cents on the big questions that we put on the handout. First of all, does geography matter in a borderless 21st century world? And then secondly, what are China's geo-economic strengths and weaknesses in the era of Trump? First, as far as the first of those questions, I think you can say at least my argument as a brittle generalization for the purposes of argument is yes, geography does matter. In some ways more so than half a century ago. If we take 1969 as a benchmark and 2019 as the other side, political change enhances its importance. The collapse of the Soviet Union certainly made geography much more relevant across the continent. The distance between Xinjiang and the border of Schengen became relevant, which until the collapse of the Soviet Union, it really wasn't. Domestic change makes a difference. The shift from Mao to Deng Xiaoping to Jiang Zemin to President Xi makes some difference in terms of the configuration and the meaning of geography. Because China is so big, the westward policies of President Jiang Zemin, for example, to develop the West put the center of gravity of Eurasia much further to the west and began to lead to the dynamic that I'm talking about. Economic change, China's growth matters. Russian stagnation matters. It's producing a transformation in their relationship, which I think is globally significant to both economics and security. Technological change matters, and it transforms geography. Telecommunications, internet allows production networks across the continent to develop. For example, the Chinese, a German auto industry relationship. So geography, I think, again, I'm sure this will be the point of a considerable discussion. Geography, I think, in many dimensions actually means more today than it did in 1969. What are China's geo-economic strengths and weaknesses in the era of Trump? Now, Professor Murtha can speak better to this, but let me say that I think it's useful to have a continental frame of reference to evaluate that. Some of the issues are domestic within China, certainly, but some of them relate to the nature of the continent itself and how it's changing and where China is located, not inside China, but in the world and in Eurasia. Location matters. That's one of China's strengths. It's at the heart of Asia. It's halfway to Europe. Xinjiang, Alenkou, the border areas in the west of Xinjiang are halfway to the border of Shangyang. Would it be possible that a Great Stone Industrial Park in Belarus would be the largest industrial park in the world if it weren't for that phenomenon? China's market matters. China's financial power matters. China's grand strategy matters. As I said, I think Belt and Road fundamentally, and I'll go into the warts in a minute, but I do think that Belt and Road for China is an astute grand strategy and is going to have more significance in the future of world affairs. Finally, the response of the Trump administration to all this, I think both to China and to Europe, is also something that China can also use in some ways. I do believe that, trade policy, trying to force trade policy changes in China was correct, and that the Trump administration did more along those lines than the Obama administration did. As far as that goes, I think that's true, but the kind of protracted conflict we have, also the insistence on, that's for another discussion. But I think broadly the Trump administration's policies have had important elements that China has been able to use and to strengthen the logic of its Belt and Road grand strategy. Now, weaknesses. I think the weaknesses of China are micro and at the level of implementation and execution. I'm sure Professor Murtha can refine this. Over-reliance on SOEs. Nick Lardy has an interesting book recently on the recent emphasis on state-owned corporations, and there could be no doubt is, a political logic to this for the China, but the efficiency of state-owned corporations, I think, is in question. It leads most importantly to problems in credit evaluation and to misjudging debt issues. We've heard a lot about the debt bomb and bad debts, forcing countries into bad debt and so on. And I think these issues are related to the micro structure within which the Belt and Road is being implemented. Reliance on corrupt regimes. The Najib regime in Malaysia, for example, comes to mind. And the result when there's a change in power, the coming of Mahathir, for example, and the ways that Mahathir has reacted. I'm sure Professor Jackson certainly could refine that. So micro weaknesses, grand strategy, strengths, and a geographical position, which is important. So where does that lead us? I think to conclude that to go back to Brzezinski, there is some doubt arising about Brzezinski's confident prediction. It's not so clear that Eurasia is too big to be politically one. I know that's provocative, but I look forward to the discussion. Thanks. Thank you very much. Maybe as he's coming up, I should just say Professor Murthy, tenured professor at Cornell University, one of the top China specialists in the country.
Thank you very much, Kent. It's really a privilege to be here. There's an old saying that war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. And I would aver that there's a much less costly and useful alternative to this, and that is to sit down and read Dean Calder's magnificent Supercontinent. This book is many things. It is a masterful mapping of the dense network of land and sea linkages that extend from Asia to Europe. It is a new lens through which to understand the evolution of supply chains and the future topography of globalization. And it is a wake-up call to those who hide under the increasingly outdated comfort zone of American hegemony and global influence. Indeed, it invokes Donald Rumsfeld's dismissal of old Europe, except by clear implication, it is now the United States that is old. Let me provide an example from an area that I specialize in, and that is China. So for the past almost 20 years or so, on my first day of class of my contemporary Chinese politics course, I used to begin with a comparison of China and the United States to underscore the geographic vulnerability of China and the relative security of the United States. So, and unfortunately, I had a PowerPoint, but I sent the wrong one. So I'm just going to have to kind of wave my hands. But imagine China and the United States juxtaposed with one another on the screen. Where the United States is Canada, China has Russia. Disputes over at least 2 sections of the joint border with, and despite a 1997 border agreement, and from 1960 to the 1980s, well into the 1980s, fears of cross-border conflict. And in fact, instances of border skirmishes numbering in the hundreds, if not the thousands. Where the US has the Atlantic Ocean, China has North Korea. It also has the Spratly Islands, over which it has disputes with Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, Vietnam, and Brunei. China also has the Paracel Islands, occupied by China but claimed by Vietnam and by Taiwan. Whereas the United States has Japan as an ally, China has memories of Japan as a brutal occupier and is less inclined to let down its guard. Moreover, disputes over the Senkaku, Shoto, Diaoyutai Islands continues. Where the United States has Mexico, China has a almost 1,300-kilometer border with Vietnam, with which it went to war in 1979. China also has Myanmar and the Golden Triangle. And where we have the Pacific Ocean, China has India, with which it went to war with in 1962 and continues, especially in recent weeks and months, to be on alert over disputed border areas. It also has a 523-kilometer border with Pakistan. And among the other countries in the region, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, et cetera, there are possibilities of instability owing to anti-Han Muslim insurrections, real or imagined. In other words, and in short, while, and this is what I used to tell my students, while we are nestled in the relative comfort between Mexico and Canada here in the United States, China is surrounded by some of the most dangerous and unstable countries in the world. But this outlook is in desperate need of updating, as regional and global politics that have been documented in detail by Dean Calder have altered these geographic juxtapositions. The US has gone from a secure geographic location that is the envy of the world to one of political isolation, in which we are unnecessarily antagonizing our two closest neighbors and pursuing an inward-looking America First strategy that renders key international alliances as little more than a costly nuisance. China, meanwhile, is responding to its security challenges by aggressively mitigating them economically in a breathtaking manner almost unimaginable a decade ago. The sound that you hear are the global political tectonic plates shifting. Thomas Friedman tells us that the world is flat, that the Earth is the frictionless plane that we read about in first-year physics textbooks. Dean Calder knows better. He knows how to read a political map. The world is interconnected. Much like Ken Waltz's Theory of International Politics that was published exactly 40 years ago, Dean Calder presents a vast new political landscape. Waltz predicted balancing of power, not actual balances of power. Similarly, Dean Calder lays out and analyzes the opportunities, the incentives, and nodes of greater integration without necessarily predicting how these are going to unfold. That is left to a future that is yet to be written to color within those lines that Dean Calder draws so beautifully. I would like to suggest some of these colors, and although from time to time I might end up coloring outside the lines, in the form of 4 questions that Dean Calder's analysis raises in my mind. First, it seems unlikely that this set of networks is or will be guided by a simple collective of interests among its bilateral and multilateral partners. IR theory would lead us to anticipate one of 2 outcomes, possibly more. The first is a new generation of multilateral institutions, some of which are documented here in wonderful detail. That these would govern the relations between the member states, or at the very least, create economic efficiencies and political room to resolve conflict. The second possible outcome is one of hegemonic leadership that is, using Lowy's typology, a redistributive, as distinct from a distributive, state of affairs when we bring the US into the equation. So hegemonic leadership in all likelihood by China. Which of these 2 or possibly other outcomes are more likely, and if the latter, how well equipped China is to handle these responsibilities is an important question. Second, and related to the first, the BRI plays a very large role in the analysis in supercontinent, and indeed in Chinese foreign policy. National champions, Costco, Huawei, Alibaba, are a vital part of the picture. But there are other actors that are also potentially important, either as leaders, industry leaders, or as potential political spoilers. According to a 2017 report by the National Development and Reform Commission, some 80% of overseas FDI from China, under the rubric of FDI, are from provincial and sub-provincial governments, most of whom have very different agendas and very different constraints and incentives than does Beijing. And this is part, I think, of a key insight of understanding Chinese domestic politics today. that Chinese domestic politics no longer stop at water's edge. Moreover, fragmentation at the national level between, say, and at the local levels between the Ministry of Commerce and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as their subnational units, also provide political fault lines within China that can affect its successes abroad. I don't want to overstate this, but I don't want to understate it either. Third, and I'm getting deeper and deeper into the weeds here, reports from another company, that was a Freudian slip, another country that I study, Cambodia, and elsewhere indicate that China, while masterful at wowing foreign visitors on its home turf and demonstrating the wondrous possibilities of human interaction in person-to-person relationships, is singularly awful at projecting soft power abroad. Others, like Stan Rosen, in a forthcoming volume, argue that China is more interested in deterring behavior it does not like, rather than spreading a positive image abroad. Anecdotally, in Cambodia, China has, in a remarkably short time, parlayed what could have been a tremendous amount of goodwill into fairly widespread anti-China sentiment. How important is the front lines, the retail level politics in these complex global economic networks? That's another question that that is raised by supercontinent and is, I think, it's contingent upon us to seek answers. And finally, how might China's experience in Africa as a test case, kind of pre-BRI, help us anticipate what we might expect along Dean Calder's hypotheses in supercontinent? One of the problems with existing analyses of BRI is that the project is so new that we can't really make any meaningful projections, or we can make meaningful projections, but with low degrees of probability. Or these analyses point to high-profile missteps, Myanmar, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, that Dean Calder has mentioned. And these mask a far more complex and potentially positive picture of China's overseas or overland networking relationships. Dean Calder has set a challenging task for the rest of us, and he has set the bar very, very high. I will stop here. I've gone on far too long, but let me conclude by saying that the richness and innovation of scholarship on display in supercontinent makes it a must-read and an absolutely must engage. Thank you very much.
I thought that was absolutely, those are really probing questions, and I appreciate those tremendously. Professor Murtha's ideas really stimulate a lot of response. But let me make it very brief. I know many of you have other appointments, but most importantly, I'd like to open the floor quite rapidly for discussion, because we have a number of people who really do know these issues well. Maybe to start with the last of those cases, the case of Africa. Africa is a test case. It's not a part of the Eurasian continent. It does, I think, show some similarities at the micro level in terms of the way China behaves and that are interesting. Broadly speaking, Deborah Baudigam's work impresses me in that regard. She has a book called The Dragon's Gift about Chinese aid and how it has supported economic development in Africa. You know, there are some hegemonic aspects, there's some corrupt aspects, but the contribution to economic growth, I think, broadly, has been a positive for a long period of time, right from the days of the Tanzam Railway and the support that gave Zambia against, you know, in the liberation of Southern Africa and so on. But I guess the other point, so I agree, I take what you're saying, and it is interesting. There may be some contrasts between what we see in the Eurasian cases and in Africa. But on the issue of the geo-economic implications or the global implications of China's policies in BRI, it seems to me that the symbiosis between China and Africa, it's, I guess, broadly felicitous for China and in most respects, I suppose, positive for Africa. But it doesn't have a important transformational effect on the international system itself. What it seems to me about the emergence of ties across the continent, particularly between Europe on the one hand, Europe that's changing, and China, is that that potentially has global implications, just simply because of the scale of Europe and the centrality of Europe right at the core of the international system. So those are very, you point out, some very interesting things about symbiosis and complementarity I wouldn't disagree with, but I think the continental dynamic, at least that was what I was focusing on in my book, and the global implications. We haven't gotten into them, and even in the book, I didn't have enough time, and well, we're really at the early stage of BRI and of China's interaction with Europe. So what does this mean for the world is in the era of Trump and beyond the era of Trump, I think is we really we can't easily come to terms with that. Maybe the contrast of Africa and Europe, China's interaction with the two, can give us some hints about that. It's a plus and a minus. There are some good aspects to this. There are certainly some transformational aspects as well. The second point, or going in reverse, really, about soft power. You said China's not very good at soft power. And it focuses more on deterring behavior that it doesn't like than it does on sort of contributing to global dialogues or education, or whatever the converse of that is. Broadly, I suppose that's right. That's, and that gets into a part of, it's implied by supercontinent, but I didn't get into it. What is the implication, say, for human rights or for pluralism in international affairs or for of this new development? No doubt, it gives more leverage to the third world. I'm sure that people responding to this in China would probably say that. It gives leverage to groups in the international system which have been ignored in the past, and that's sort of synergistic with what you said about Africa. On the other hand, the market, where does the market, is the market being furthered or not? In some areas, I think of Kindleberger, the market of last resort. Every system needs a stabilizer. It's crucial, as it was in the Depression, for a market-oriented system to come through and to deal with global needs. What China does on the environment, what China did in 2008 in expanding global demand when the world was faced with a global depression. Those aspects, there's a case that can be made, I think, on either side of some of this. But on the human rights, certainly the human rights as one element of the overall equation are there. What's the implication of a social credit system if you spread this around the world through, Chinese assistance or soft power or whatever? So those two, I think you've raised really important questions. Provincial actors. What difference do provincial actors make within China? I didn't really get into that in detail. That's quite fascinating, and from what I understand, important in some areas. All I can say is you know that one far better than I, and I think that's a subject for for more research.
Yeah.
What do local governments, I mean, Afghanistan is one case, resource development in Afghanistan. Some local actors in China have gotten involved in development in copper mining and so on there. Now, is this going to draw China into a security relationship in Afghanistan or something like that? We have a session tomorrow, incidentally, relating to Afghanistan. That's an interesting question to raise there. That's something that really ought to be examined more. And I think there's a lot of this topic where China specialists, certainly I'm sure, can tell us much more than I've been able to. Now, finally, on the question of governance, does the, is this multilateral? Where is the kind of world where BRI is getting more important, or where China's role in the system is growing? Does this mean Chinese hegemony? Does this mean multilateralism in which China plays some key role? Those are two options. I guess I think it's the third. It's really something under the radar. It's China, giving support for various groups. In that, as far as it goes, China's argument that this is a win-win proposition, no one has to accept Belt and Road funding unless it wants to. There's some degree of truth to that, although, it's also involved with corrupt dealings with non-democratic governments and so on in many cases. But I think it operates through a distributive benefits to roads and bridges and things that will affect the land price, which of course is very, very political in so many countries. That is letting China create a new hybrid system, which is really probably neither of those. It's not hegemonic. I don't think China really is aiming at that right now. But if Belt and Road is an extremely important part of the budgets of countries and affects their political interests, take certain the Rajapaksa's government in Sri Lanka. China helped to end the civil war there. They built Hambantota. They had the Rajapaksa government, almost as a vassal state. But then there was still democracy, and they got thrown out of power. There was an election, and they got thrown out. Or look at what happened in Malaysia. So, this kind of a system, I don't think it needs necessary. If I had to choose, I would say it won't lead to hegemony, both because some of it self-destructs. The Chinese, as you were saying, on soft power, they're their own worst enemy sometimes, or they're bribing too many people, or because they don't have the resources and they don't really want to dominate. But they have a position at the center that does give them advantages. They don't need to establish a new framework. They can exist inside the existing framework because of how large they are and the resources they have and their centrality. Does this need to lead to multilateralism? Maybe yes, but I don't even think that they feel a need for that. Again, it's their centrality, their geographical position, the resources that they have, their networks, all the things that Belt and Road does. So isn't there another, that's why I think this is a new configuration that's neither bird nor fowl. But then I think that probably leads to some interesting questions. So I don't know, maybe if you could lead that discussion.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So why don't we just go straight to questions from those of you who've been patiently.
I'm struck by the degree to which Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan have played no role whatsoever in this conversation so far. And yet, you know, in terms of trade, I don't know the figures, but I suspect the figures are greater than the trans-Asia figures. How would, how do they affect this picture of the supercontinent?
That's a really interesting and important question. And, you know, I was continually, as being fundamentally a Japan specialist, I've been thinking a lot about that question. Japan is an island nation off the coast, of course. It's a economic superpower in its own right, very close in nominal terms to China's GDP, and for many years, of course, it was the second largest in the world. I think for many countries, it provides a counterpoint, and an alternative. And I think it's extremely important for many of them, precisely because the compelling force of China's expansion is so great. Malaysia, I think, is a very good case in point, and what we see happening in Malaysia over time with the Mahathir, dissatisfaction with Najib's government, and Mahathir came back in a democratic government, and Japan helped to offset or to maintain more pluralism in the system. I think it slows down the progress of it makes the Eurasian continent more pluralistic than it would otherwise be. I think from a long-term perspective, the healthiest outcome in this is, considerably more pluralism, so that this doesn't lead to implicit Chinese hegemony. Yeah.
If I could just add, I mean, in the book, you actually spend a fair amount of time talking about Japan and South Korea, particularly when you're talking about financing institutions and recognizing these trends and kind of becoming part of it. That just didn't really make as large play as large a role in the presentation here.
Yeah, no, I absolutely thank you. And it depends on the country and the place, but I think it creates a system that is more pluralistic and more of a balance, and it helps to sustain, prevent this from becoming a China-dominated juggernaut. I think there is, partly simply because of the broader geo-economic logic, there are some deepening ties between China and Japan that are beginning to develop. Of course, there are geopolitical tensions, needless to say. And I think the role of the United States, and maybe I should add this too, in my policy prescription, I say that I do think it's very important for the U.S. to be engaged and the U.S. to support the role that Japan can play in the region, the constructive role. Also Korea, for that matter, and India also. Also, the whole question of the Indo-Pacific strategy. It seems to me that the way that Belt and Road is proceeding means that the maritime side and an Indo-Pacific strategy is important, but it needs to be more focused. We've seen so much of it really at the level of rhetoric, but there are some critical nodes, for example, ports, logistics. I think things like these nodes, the port, we got Piraeus and Bangladesh. There's an interesting case of where Japan, the United States, India, several countries work together to prevent BRI, and BRI does have its constructive aspects. I don't mean to say that, but it also needs to be prevented from being hegemonic. And I think the case of Bangladesh is interesting, where those other, you got an outcome that allows China some participation, but it's not dominant because of the role of Korea and Japan.
Thanks for the presentations, which were great. I'm thinking a little bit about, in the British Empire, we used to say, trade followed the flag. Colonies would be set up, trade followed. In North America, our experience of continentalism, the flag followed trade. Businesses went, established networks, and then governments created a mechanism so you could govern those transactions at businesses' request. Which is it in the supercontinent? Is business driving, is government driving, and does it matter?
I think the flag followed trade is really what I see. And that is my supposition about the future of China's role in Asia. I was quite struck, as some of you know, I once was an African specialist. I mentioned my, being in Africa Hall and its foundation, and I did African history, and Robinson and Gallagher, The Scramble for Africa, was a book that impressed me. And as you know, Chris, I'm sure you know that one as well. That was a clear case in the Scramble for Africa of trade, of the flag following trade, or the economic imperatives emerging. Now, possibly France was different, but in the case of Britain, I think it was trade being the spearhead, and then when a crisis occurred, then the flag came later, the Boer War, after you had all the investment on the Rand, Witwatersrand, and so on, or the Suez Canal's established and it's threatened, and so we have to have a protectorate in Egypt. And this leads to that's where imperialism comes from. And that, my supposition is that the rise of China economically and its deepening investment overseas will lead to deepening security commitments. And one example is Afghanistan. And as the United States pulls down, and I think we're in the twilight of that involvement, I think some of the recent involvements that China's begun to have could well lead to a larger security role. In the Gulf is another area. China has avoided a political military involvement in the Gulf. But what will happen if the Gulf becomes highly unstable and China's interests are threatened? So Robinson and Gallagher, in thinking about the future of Chinese foreign policy, people should read Robinson and Gallagher.
There's a question back there.
Thank you, Professor Calder, and thank you, Professor Martha. I'm Shining Tan, and I work at IMF right now. I have this question because Professor Martha raised a very good point about anti-China sentiments right now, and I feel that this could be a major challenge for this flag-following trade issue. And my question is, do you think this anti-China sentiment will remain to be a big challenge, or it can be resolved by either China's effort to improve its relationship, or by this kind of authoritarian anti-liberal turn in those countries such as Russia and India and Turkey?
Well, thank you. I think this is really a tremendously important problem, and I'll be interested in Professor Murtha's response. As he was saying earlier, I think often China has not been probably as astute at, this is in part a problem of big powers. The United States at times has not been as astute as it could be, although if we had more people, I was listening to Bill Burns last night, if we had more people like that, I think it would be much easier. But no, I guess I would say China has become more active. But if, as technological nationalism, technology rises. China's, the pluses, I think, for China are probably like the environment. China has had a set of rather enlightened policies on the environment that I don't think have maybe gotten as much credit as they deserve. However, there's other issues in the political military area and the human rights area that I think are hurting China probably. Even though it's got quite a active, overseas public diplomacy program now.
So just very quickly, I think what we know right now is really unsystematic. It's anecdotal, and so it's hard to draw, too many conclusions with too much confidence. I mentioned Cambodia simply because that's a case that I'm particularly familiar with, and it's something that has the anti-China sentiment there has really kind of arisen fairly quickly. But at the same time, I recall in April I was part of a conference out at Berkeley, which was a second kind of stage of the conference or that led to the document about China's sharp power. And essentially what it was is there were several different panels. There was one that was kind of North America and Europe. Then there was one that was Asia. And then there was, in the afternoon, the Africa panel. And as we moved kind of away from North America and to Asia and to Africa, the sentiments, not simply the sentiments, but the evaluations and the analysis of China's sharp power really changed somewhat dramatically. So, just very quickly, North America and Europe was somewhat similar to kind of the U.S. way of thinking that this is something to be suspicious of and cautious about and potentially even worried about. As we moved to Asia, and I was representing Southeast Asia, so take that with a grain of salt. But nonetheless, in the Asia panel, it was far more nuanced, and it was there were a lot of different types of interpretations that were up for debate, rather than kind of a much smaller setup. And then in the afternoon, by the time we moved to Africa, it was, Africa is, pretty much welcomes China, and not with eyes wide open, which is to say, one of the sentiments, and there was a former minister in Liberia who essentially said, when the West came here, they took our resources. When China comes here, they take our resources, but at least they build roads. And beyond being flippant, what was fascinating to me, and this gets back to the soft power question, is that if a country is an authoritarian regime, China will kind of work with that regime based on its political system. If it's a democratic regime, and Dean Calder referred to this, with Malaysia and with Sri Lanka, this is very much the case in Africa as well. China has been able to, or its representatives on the ground there have been able to work quite well. They've learned kind of how to play the political game there. You don't have these blind spots, and as a result, you have a very far more nuanced interaction on the ground than the rhetoric might.
Yeah, I thought that's extremely acute, and I should just add briefly experiences that Toshko and I had in Paraguay and in Costa Rica with Huawei. I think Huawei in both of those countries was welcomed. They have the headquarters right in the middle of town. Their phones are cheap. Lots of people have them. The Baltics, there's all kinds of places that find Chinese products to be inexpensive, and then China provided the football stadium down in Costa Rica, and it's sort of very parallel to what you say. They build roads or they build infrastructure. We don't feel competition with them. So it's positive.
I mean, there's a low baseline. I mean, King Leopold and all that, but nonetheless, but nonetheless.
Hi, my name is Greg. I'm a fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute, working with Carla here at SAIS this fall. I work at Nottingham's campus in Ningbo, China. I have a PhD student who's doing something similar. Well, he just defended actually, but it's about Central Asian integration. And I wanted to run this by you to see if this jives with what you found. So he's interested in the relationship between Russia and China in Central Asia, and he sees mostly competition between the two. That was sort of Russia's turf, and now China is being very careful and very wise in how they kind of incrementally increase their influence there. But what he finds, this is what I want to ask you if you see this, is he finds that Central Asian integration has been fostered by China's role there because Moscow always preferred sort of a hub and spoke kind of thing, that all roads lead to Moscow. So Russia never encouraged regional integration because they wanted it to come always back to them. But China is building roads and railways and fiber optic networks that are actually having sort of this side effect of increasing, contact between all those regional powers, which in a way is undermining Russia's position. Did you see this at all?
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, I did spend a little time in Kazakhstan and then we were in Xinjiang and some of these places, and I do think that that's the pattern. Sometimes I've been called a conservative Marxist every so often, and the reason I think is that I do think the economic forces drive, and Chris's question about following the flag, or which way is it? I think the economic drivers ultimately drive deeper processes. In this case, maybe in the Central Asian case, what China's done economically, of course it's within a context where the politics, already the collapse of the Soviet Union allowed it. I think China has been fostering integration across Central Asia, and then things recently like the opening of Uzbekistan, I think are feeding on that.
Thanks. Two really great presentations. I was wondering about demographics and how that fits into your thinking, Kent, about the supercontinent. China, of course, is headed for demographic changes that will be even more severe than Japan's. And India will have a bigger population in the not too distant future. And throughout the supercontinent, there are other countries that are facing demographic decline. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that. And if I might, in terms of geography, the Arctic is warming more quickly than any other part of the world, and it will become navigable for most of the, if not all of the year in the very near future. I wonder how that also would affect your thinking about the supercontinent.
Those are great questions. And I think those two those both demography and also global warming are going to have importance on the pattern. But I think what this really leads to is deeper integration in some ways. The military challenge, or thinking of all of this in stark political military terms, in terms of a expansion of Chinese military capabilities and so on. I think the likelihood of that, of a hegemonic transformation to military dominance, Chinese dominance in Asia, that is undermined by demography. So if that's the paradigm that one has, I think its likelihood is reduced over time. However, the aging of China is going to mean there's going to be big labor flows probably. Now, in the case of Japan, Japan is resisting, immigration, which I think in a way is holding back. It's going to be very hard to hold back sort of the wheel of history that way. But with China, it's an even bigger thing. And I think what this means is immigration into China. And so a deeper integration of the labor forces, especially like Southeast Asia and China. We already see some of that. Andy can speak more to that. But on global warming, that's a very interesting question. I think this means more Chinese interest in the Arctic. One subject several of us are really quite interested in now is the Arctic and how it will evolve and what does this mean for world affairs. And I think China has an interaction with the Arctic Council. I know Carla is doing some really interesting work in this whole area. So I think global warming is going to mean East Asian countries are going to be more engaged. With Russia, at least, already you can see this, like the Novotech project, and near Novaya Zemlya in the Arctic. More resource extraction, more involvement by China, probably Japan and Korea too. All three of the Northeast Asians are going to be involved. So it's more, I would see more integration rather than sort of the dissipation of this phenomenon.
Can I just add one? It's a small point, but it's a riff on your response to the demographic question. And I think one of the areas where we're seeing, or one of the drivers of anti-China sentiment in these kind of recipient countries, if you will, is the fact that you've got the kind of export of Chinese labor from China into these places. And with demographic trends being what they are, that might be mitigated somewhat as well. So not simply, the potential kind of import of labor into China, but also kind of a ceasing and desisting of kind of Chinese kind of full dragon service, if you will, in these recipient countries.
Interesting.
Hello, my name is Jakub Wrześniewski, and I worked with Professor Calder before. I had a question about the concept of Eurasianism, which has been around for a very long time, the dream of an integrated Eurasia as a counterbalance, perhaps to the maritime powers of the United Kingdom and the United States. And in the 19th century, it was the Russian Empire that tried to push a form of Eurasian integration. It constructed the Trans-Siberian Railroad. It established its sphere of influence in Manchuria, northern China, Port Arthur, Harbin. Later on, it integrated Central Asia, maybe with this hub and spoke system, but for the first time, there was modern infrastructure in Central Asia. But ultimately, there were severe limitations to where that could go, and you end up with this trunk line across Siberia linking Europe and East Asia, which is not nothing, but it's also not an integrated Eurasian space. What changes do you think have taken place that enable China perhaps to transcend those limitations, or are we going to see just a thickening of that trunk line?
Well, I think certainly the collapse of the Soviet Union opened a new space. The hub and spokes, of course, Moscow, everything was out of Moscow. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Moscow's ability to do that, to compel that, disappeared. And the Chinese interest was broader networks across the continent. I mean, China's political economy I take to be more with multiple centers, 4 or 5, say, major economic centers, as opposed to a politically induced focus on Moscow alone. Plus, given China's location, you know, there's multiple routes across the continent. There's sort of moving north to the Trans-Siberian. There's the Trans-Caspian route in the south that goes across Turkey and so on. There's different routes in the middle. So China naturally, both in terms of its relations with Europe and also just developing different parts of Central Asia, had a much more sort of geographically pluralistic sort of approach. And they're the ones who were building the new infrastructure. So they did it that way rather than in the hub and spokes.
Jim, did you?
Thank you very much, Dean Calder. And I'd like to push back or interrogate a little something that perhaps Professor Murtha is also guilty by association involved in. That's this questioning of the continued logic of Zbig-Brzezinski's notion that Eurasia is too large to be integrated. And the central question occurs to me is that in the short to medium term, there's actually disintegration across Eurasia. Walking from east to west, we see a sort of neo-Cold War, according to some, or at least a hardening of rivalry between the United States and its hub-and-spoke alliance system in China. South, you see India and China becoming engaged in some form of security competition. Russia and Europe, obviously, are more estranged now than they have been since the 1990s. Europe itself is also seemingly disintegrating from within. And my question is, I think that we've seen in history before cases where there's an economic logic of integration across a politically disjointed system. You think of the end of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century in Europe, where economic linkages and interdependence did not result in any form of political unity. Indeed, might have actually amplified political disunity by encouraging rivalry between powers. Why is this time potentially different? What are the drivers, the structural drivers of that difference?
Okay, great question, as I would have expected from you. I think the first thing that's different is the degree of the infrastructure and the technology. The production networks are also the multinational firms. The fineness of the integration in that sense, I think, is greater. It's true that before World War I, of course, there was a high level of international trade, but there wasn't the very rapid. There weren't the transnational production networks that we have now. The multinational corporations, certainly in this particular space, were not developed in the way that they are now. Sort of interactive systems, e-commerce, production networks, that kind of thing. Also sort of small, the multiplicity of actors. I think it's a positive thing in the system as a whole that you have so many smaller actors right now that are operating in the system. I was talking about Uzbekistan, about Turkey, So anyway, the level of integration, I think, is one thing which is different in the fineness and the interactive character of the integration. I don't think you can certainly argue that everything is unified or that unification is, or for that matter, that that's necessary. For the phenomenon that I'm talking about, particularly the relationship between Central and Eastern Europe and China, that core relationship, Germany's relation with China, I think, is quite important in all of this, as well as countries to the east of that. That is, I think that's unprecedented. The political barriers, of course, for example, the existence of e-commerce, all of that is more or less unprecedented. The scale of the trade interdependence is within the core. I mean, there are still places like Chechnya, or there's Kashmir, of course, or you mentioned the tensions between Russia and Eastern Europe, say the Ukraine crisis. Well, actually, in that specific case, I think those tensions actually are what drive the pattern of core integration that I see as between China and Central and Eastern Europe. So, yeah, very, very interesting, provocative question. The core integration doesn't require total integration. There's still going to be areas of considerable volatility. But the underlying relationships between the core, particularly the areas that are of greatest importance to the international system, namely Europe and China, I think are unprecedented.
Can I just add something to, I mean, kind of getting at the flip side of your response, but also bringing in this, the idea of kind of the difference between the kind of the spoke and wheel, versus, I mean, one of the differences in that analogy, of course, is, that the 19th century was a time of alliances. And this is, yes, alliances exist today, but they're far less set in the kind of stone or steel, the language of the time, than they were then. Things are much more fluid, which could, things could end badly, but it is something that is different. And from that time. The other thing also is, China. One of the things that China, in terms of its exercise of governance and politics, as you well know, is it's not simply, top down. It's very spatial as well. This is something that, really distinguishes the kind of Chinese Leninism, for example, than Soviet Leninism, and whatever that might be, whatever you want to call it, I think is something that does fuel the logic as well as the practice of kind of what's underlying the ways in which it interacts with these other, states and non-state actors. I just think my sense is there's just a degree of flexibility, a degree of give that we don't necessarily often assign to China, but nonetheless is very much there, in contrast to, say, Russia.
Mm-hmm. So I think in sum, we have a drift in the direction of greater coherence, but separate, tendencies pulling in the other direction that you're pointing to that still remains significant. It will slow this down. It may prevent a full it will prevent, I think, probably a full integration, but still the overall drift is in that direction. That's the way I would see it.
Oh, John.
Thanks. Let me just ask a couple questions on, is this working? On finance. Yes, it is? Yes, it is working. Okay. The rapid growth of the ASEAN economies took place in the context of what we call the the dominance of the East Asian dollar standard, in which the ASEAN economies essentially bolted their domestic economy to a fixed rate through a fixed rate to the dollar, which meant that their weakness in domestic financial systems was irrelevant as long as the dollar peg remained viable, because that meant that using the dollar system, the U.S. financial system, was equivalent to the domestic system. That got scrambled, of course, by the Asian currency crisis, which was a reflection of essentially instability in the yen-dollar rate. Now, since that time, more recently with the emergence of rapid Chinese growth, China's 11th, 12th, and 13th five-year plans have described their plans as making the RMB both convertible in the context of a well-developed domestic financial markets and open capital markets. And there was a great conviction that in that context, China was anxious to promote the international use of the RMB. Now, more recently, the troubles, the difficulties of both the international environment and the domestic economic reform has led actually in recent years to a diminished use of the RMB in international trade, and at the same time, more recently, a closing of China's capital markets through capital controls. So two questions. One, do you believe that in the long run the Chinese authorities are serious about their claim as contained in the 5-year plan that they intend to move to a convertible currency, operate in a context of a modern open financial market? And if so, if that were to be the case, how would the neighboring countries, especially Japan and Korea, have to adjust their policies? And would this result in much greater Asian financial integration as distinct from a relationship to the dollar market?
That's a fascinating set of questions. I think probably Chinese technocrats have positive aspirations along those lines, and I mean, many of them that you know better than I, but that I know a little bit, I think do have those aspirations to openness, and there's some outstanding technocrats. I think, working on this, I think there are at least, if you take in particularly with the party PLA sort of dominant element within China, a belief or a belief in a different sort of paradigm. And I think some of this is implicit in the BRI itself. Very heavily infrastructure-based, fiscal spending, infrastructure spending, the creation of privileged relationships with surrounding countries, stimulus through, the ideas that flowed out of the massive stimulus package in the 2008 and 9, that you can get economic areas that are closely related to China with which you can deal in a transactional way without broad opening. And to the extent that you need sophisticated transactions, that you can handle them through special economic zones like Hong Kong, or maybe a new variants of Shanghai financial markets that do have the kind of parameters and rule of law and so on that you think that you need. Sort of a dual structure system. I think that is implicit, and then rely for financing on huge sovereign wealth funds, the high domestic savings rate, and then the intermediaries become, the 4 large banks, state-owned banks or sovereign wealth funds, a less market intermediated system. That's my impression of what China would like to create, and in that kind of a system, probably a place like Hong Kong would have some considerable importance. It could, which is one of the reasons that what's going on right now, I think, is important. But Andy knows something about this.
Well, no, and I think this is consistent with what you were saying. My sense is, it comes down to capital controls, and I'm thinking of, there's at least 2 kind of within the past generation. There's 2 global incidents where China has been able to establish its its legitimacy as a as a kind of professional kind of keeper of kind of fiscal responsibility, and that's the East Asian economic crisis, and then more recently the global financial crisis. And in both of those cases, China went very much against its immediate interests, and was able to derive a tremendous amount of kind of global legitimacy. And it was based on its ability to really kind of control things down at the micro level. And my sense is that when push comes to shove, Beijing would be loath to give up that, that kind of.
If I could add just one thing, I do hear an awfully lot of interest in China in Japan's experience with loosening capital controls, and hear an awfully lot of people saying that in various ways China shouldn't just repeat Japan's mistakes. And the way that it liberalized capital controls could have been part of it.
We've got a few minutes left. Any last questions?
I think we're fine.
So we'll quit while we're ahead. Thank you all so much for attending, and this was really a lot of fun.
Thank
Thanks
you very
so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Yeah.